This is a copy of the presentation delivered by the museum at Hereford Town Hall on Saturday the 17th of May 2025. It includes an opening address by Hugh Patterson, the chairman of the Friends of the Museum, and a closing address by Mr. Edward Harley, the Lord Lieutenant for Herefordshire, who is the patron of the museum. Also included are some slides of the artifacts which were on display that evening. This slide shows the display of all the items which were shown that evening. Some close-ups of the items are shown later in this presentation.
Sheriff, Chairman of the Herefordshire Council, Mayor of Hereford, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hugh Patterson. I'm the Chairman of the Herefordshire Light Infantry Museum Trust. And on behalf of the Trust, I'd like to welcome you all this evening to a very rare event. This is only the second time in 50 years that we have brought together and displayed in Hereford the baton and car pennant of Grand Admiral Donitz, Hitler's successor as head of government of the German Third Reich. In a moment, Andy Taylor will tell us how and why they're here. Thank you also for being here to support the Hereford Light Infantry Museum. We're a small museum, volunteer-run, with no formal funding. So fundraising evenings like this are important to help us meet running costs, insurance premiums, etc. We also have an organization that supports us called the Friends of the Hereford Museum. And they pay a small subscription every year for which they get newsletters and access to podcasts about the museum and linked matters. So if any of you would like to become a friend, please pick up a leaflet off any of the tables here before you leave, and we'd be delighted to see you. This evening is part of the VE80 celebrations that have been taking place over the nation during the last week or so. Looking back to World War II, the Herefords were a territorial single battalion regiment, and as part of 11th Armoured Division, they landed over the beaches of Normandy on D+6 in June 1944, after 4 years of training in the UK. They then fought their way through France, the Low Countries, and Germany. And 80 years ago today, we're moving into Flensburg, right up on the border with Denmark in North Germany. And Andy will talk more about that. So please charge up your glasses and prepare for a treat as Andy tells us the story of Blackout. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you. The curator, Andy Taylor, delivering the presentation. Blackout was the last operation of World War II in Northwest Europe. It was the arrest of the post-Hitler Nazi German government, and this presentation covers the operation and the Herefordshire Regiment's part in it. First, though, let's look at the situation in Germany in the last days of the war and the first days of peace. By April 1945, it was clear that Germany was defeated. But Hitler would not surrender, even though defeat was now inevitable. Hitler committed suicide in Berlin on the 30th of April, and the city surrendered to Russian forces on the 1st of May. Hitler had a succession plan, but the obvious choices of Himmler and Goering had committed acts Hitler considered treacherous to him, and they were overlooked, and Hitler nominated Grand Admiral Donitz to be his successor. By the 30th of April, Berlin had been surrounded and isolated by Russian troops. American and Russian troops had met up on the River Elbe and cut Germany in two. British troops had reached the Baltic coast, further isolating German troops in the east. Hitler and many Germans had an obsession with the threat of Bolshevism. Hitler had a deluded idea that the Allies would join with Germany and turn and fight Russia. This remained the hope of many Nazis, even after the surrender had been signed. Donitz, as head of the German Navy, had to a degree kept himself away from Nazism and politics, and it probably came as a surprise to him to be Hitler's successor. He had masterminded the U-boat campaign, having been a U-boat skipper in World War I, and his only son was lost in a U-boat in the Battle of the Atlantic. Donitz has set up his headquarters and government in a naval barracks complex in Mervik, just north of Flensburg, North Germany, on the Baltic coast. Donitz was more of a realist and saw a negotiated peace settlement as the way ahead. There was also real fear of what Russia would do to capture German troops in the occupied territories, perhaps based on what Germany had done to East Europeans and Russians in 1940-41. And his negotiations were buying time to enable troops from the east, at threat from Russia, to recover west. He was also trying to negotiate that German forces in the east would surrender to American forces. However, this delaying tactic did not wear with the Western Allies, and an unconditional surrender of all Axis forces in the west was signed on Lunenburg Heath on the 4th of May, to be followed by a signing in Berlin for the surrender of all Axis troops on the 8th of May, VE Day. Northwest Europe, indeed all of Europe, was in total chaos. The civilian infrastructure had been destroyed. Many countries had no government. Some even had parties in conflict about who should govern and how they should govern. The Allied forces, through the Allied Control Commission, had assumed the role of government in many cases, but were often resented, and already a deep rift was developing over the approach of the Western Allies and Russia. There were discharged Axis troops everywhere, mostly lacking any command structure, many retaining their arms and just taking to their feet and walking home, wherever home was. Released prisoners of war were doing the same. On top of this, there were literally millions of refugees, displaced personnel, slave workers, and freed concentration camp inmates, confused, starving, not knowing what to do or where to go. Did their country, region, or town still even exist? Many of these people were desperate. Arms were everywhere, and there were still fanatical Nazis who would support Hitler even in death. Safety could not be guaranteed, as indicated by this Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force signal stating, "All defensive precautions will be taken." This was the situation the Herefordshire Regiment, as part of 159 Brigade, 11 Armoured Division, found themselves in at the end of the war. They had landed over the beaches of Normandy on D+6, had fought across France, Belgium, and Holland into Germany. On VE Day, they were at Lubeck and moved to Flensburg on the 13th of May, where the brigade commander, Brigadier Jack Churcher, assumed the role of military governor of the local area. This area of Germany had been spared blanket bombing. Most buildings remained intact, and agriculture was still functioning at the local level. The changeover from war to peace meant for the soldiers of the Herefordshire Regiment that the relaxed, personalised forms of battle uniform were out, replaced by new, pristine and pressed battle dress and bulled boots. The peace was welcomed, but not quite so much the spit and polish and bull. Donitz had set up his government in a naval complex comprising their officer cadet school and other barracks about Flensburg. Schloss Glucksburg had become a centre for high-ranking Nazi Party members and politicians. The Schloss was a sensitive location as it was the ancestral home of the Dukes of Mecklenburg, the current Duke being a cousin of King George VI. The government was established in the Central Sports Hall of the Navy School, and Donitz established himself in the Commandant's house. Donitz appeared to sack hardline Nazis. Many senior government figures saw the light, and many stopped wearing uniform. The Allies saw this and thought the government could help Germany transition from war to peace. However, this was not to be, as various elements were still overtly Nazi, and the whole complex had become a no-go area to the Allies, with armed guards on all the gates. On one visit to the complex, Brigadier Churcher was convinced he saw Himmler scurrying into a side room. The presence of Himmler, a wanted war criminal, was denied. The Donitz government had also made a radio broadcast claiming they had the Allies' agreement and were the rightful and only government of Germany. This was totally unacceptable to the Allies. Churcher organised a squad to enter the complex and dismantle the broadcasting facilities, so there could not be a repeat of this. Brigadier Churcher referred the matter up his chain of command, expressing his concern, and was somewhat surprised to receive a phone call direct from Field Marshal Montgomery and being ordered to liquidate the Donitz government. This was the genesis of Op Blackout. The Allied Control Commission had set up a local headquarters on the liner Patria in Flensburg harbour. Op Blackout was developed under the utmost secrecy. 159 Brigade, under command of Brigadier Jack Churcher, who had been the commanding officer of the Herefordshire Regiment until shortly after landing in Normandy, was to conduct the operation, planned for the morning of the 23rd of May. The plan was for a simple cordon to be set up around each location, and then troops to move in and make arrests. A key aim was that there should be no bloodshed on either side. This aspect of the plan relied on the German military commanders, Admirals Donitz and Admiral von Friedeberg and General Jodl, being called to the Patria and not being on site to initiate opposition and cause trouble. They were summoned to a meeting on board the Patria at 09:45 hours. H hour for the operation was 1000 hours. The 15th, 19th Hussars put in a cordon, and the Herefordshire Regiment and the Cheshire Regiment entered the locations. The operation was a total success. Almost complete surprise was achieved, and over 5,000 individuals detained. The arrest procedures required a full search of all those arrested, and many men complained of the indignity of having to drop their trousers. One account tells of men of the Herefordshire Regiment surprising a group of German wrens in the shower. It concludes by saying they soon departed, but it doesn't say if they were the wrens or the soldiers. Some 300 senior officers and officials were arrested, and many transferred to the Patria for interrogation. They objected to travelling in the back of a truck and only being allowed one suitcase and having to carry it themselves. It was thought that many Nazi personalities could be holed up in Schloss Glücksburg, and Churchill directed that particular attention should be paid to the search there. The information was correct, and high-ranking personalities were arrested. Dr. Speer, the Nazi Minister of Armaments and Production, was amongst them, and was arrested by the 1st Cheshires. Several high-ranking Nazis were later arrested posing as soldiers in a hospital, and William Joyce, Lord Haha, and his wife were arrested trying to make their way into Denmark. The Schloss later became a prison for high-ranking Nazis. At the same time, the 3 officers at the Patria had been arrested. The 4th officer in this picture is Donitz's military attaché, but they were allowed to return in their own cars to the barracks to collect their belongings. They were each to be escorted by an Allied control officer, but confusion reigned, and prisoners and escorts became separated. When the German officers arrived back at their quarters, they were unescorted. This confusion enabled Admiral Friedeberg to commit suicide. The Allied officers on the ground knew that the Germans should have been arrested and put them under arrest. Thus the claim by both the Herefordshire Regiment and the Cheshire Regiment that they arrested Donitz and Jodl. Major Crofts, commanding A Company of the Herefords, had the task to secure the Commandant's house, and he rearrested Donitz. Major Croft can be seen here in the bottom right of the steps, and his medals are on display this evening. The key prisoners were then taken from the barracks and Schloss Glücksburg to Headquarters 159 Brigade, which was established in the police station in Flensburg. They were corralled into the yard, and they were exposed to the press.
This was the scene at Flensburg after the arrest of the so-called German government. Donitz, Jodl and Friedeberg leave the liner Patria, to which they'd been summoned to hear that they were now prisoners of war. Donitz, the self-styled Führer, Jodl, the former chief of staff, and Friedeberg, already no doubt resolved to take his own life. It was a day of mass arrests amounting to between 5,000 and 6,000 Germans. These included at least 300 high-ranking officers and 40 important civilian officials, as well as all the small fry. Obviously, the new firm of Donitz, Jodl and Company were hoping to go into business in a big way. At any rate, they'd got together a pretty large and, I dare say, very efficient staff. But already, the new firm had gone smash, and the outward signs of bankruptcy were there in plenty. Even senior executives like Rear Admiral Wagner had to fall in with their hands up. It was while all this was going on that Friedeberg contrived to commit suicide. This is his corpse just after he'd taken poison. As for the other heads of the firm, they were lined up to be questioned by war correspondents. Speer, in civilian clothes, the Minister of Armaments and Production. Donitz, who claimed to have succeeded Hitler. And as Prussian and as truculent as you'd naturally expect of such a type, General Jodl. Well, their firm is bankrupt, and they must never draw up another prospectus, for it would certainly have as its object World War No. 3.
From Flensburg police station, they were taken to Flensburg airfield and flown to the Allied internment camp at Bas-Mondorf, Luxembourg. Again, soldiers from the Herefordshire Regiment provided guards. This slide shows Donitz on board the Dakota on his journey into captivity. There are accounts of the American crew crowding Donitz and trying to acquire his autograph. Donitz, Jodl and Speer were all tried as war criminals. Jodl was sentenced to death and hanged. Donitz received a sentence of 10 years and Speer 20 years. In 1971, Dr. Speer wrote a letter, which is on display here this evening, and refers to the conduct of a sergeant from the Herefords when he was arrested and escorted into captivity. He says, "I want to thank the sergeant of this regiment for those very few first seconds of the start of another life. I feel he understood what my feelings must be and acted in a sympathetic way." It would be interesting to know what the sergeant's thoughts were. Speer had been Hitler's Minister of Production and head of the TOT organization. They were uniformed, and Speer often wore uniform. However, from early 1945 onwards, he was never seen in uniform, and some think this was due to his acceptance the war was lost and an effort to try and distance himself from the Nazis. But what of the story of the pennants and the baton? The Herefordshire Regiment had provided the 24-hour guard on the Patria overnight the 22nd, 23rd of May, and you can clearly see the Hereford's cap badge here. Lieutenant Ken Crockford was the guard commander. He was called on board the Patria on the evening before the operation, when a general briefing was being given. He was told guard changeover the next day would be delayed until midday because of the operation. The civilian captain of the Patria insisted that Donitz, as head of the German government, should be accorded all courtesies on his arrival, even to the extent of rolling out a red carpet. Ken was told to produce a guard of honor. This video is not of Donitz arriving at the Patria, but it shows his car flying his pennants. When the party had boarded the ship, the red carpet was immediately rolled up, and it was clear that no courtesies would be paid to the party on their departure. Ken recalled that the sergeant of the guard, unfortunately he couldn't recall his name, on hearing this, literally whipped the pennants from the Admiral's car, saying, "He won't be needing these anymore then, will he?" They are now displayed in the Regimental Museum, and here this evening in a frame which says, "These were removed by soldiers of the 1st Battalion, the Herefordshire Regiment, for safekeeping, and we keep them safe still." Ken's medals are also on display this evening. He had previously been awarded the Military Cross for operations around Antwerp. As to the baton, Donitz, as Grand or Gross Admiral, was Admiral of the Fleet. On appointment, he had been presented with the baton by Hitler, this very baton. It is incredibly detailed, as you can see. On arrest, Donitz returned to the Commandant's house to collect his possessions. His batman had packed 7 suitcases for him. He was told he could only select one. The suitcase he selected contained all his underwear. Depending how you look at it, a wise or an unwise choice. 2 members of the field security section were detailed to search the other suitcases, where they discovered the baton. Speaking afterwards, they said they discussed keeping the baton as a souvenir, but thought it would be too hot, so they handed it to Brigadier Churcher. The exact path of the baton from then is not known, But in the 1950s, commanding officers of the Herefordshire Light Infantry, on handover, visited Lloyd's Bank in the city to view and sign for the baton. It is assumed it was on loan to the regiment from the then General Churcher, who was the regiment's honorary colonel. On the demise of the regiment in 1966, it was returned to General Churcher. I think in 1968 it was loaned to the Shropshire Regimental Museum by General Churcher, and a few years later gifted to them. General Churcher had been an officer in the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, and the Herefordshire Regiment was administered by the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, so this move had some logic to it. Grand Admiral Donitz's Grand Admiral's baton on display on the evening. Grand Admiral Donitz's car pennants, together with a photograph of Albert Speer. The photograph of Albert Speer with the framed letter written in 1971. The medal groups of Major Crofts and Lieutenant Crockford's, both of which include the Military Cross. Also on display are some Nazi memorabilia, which are similar to those which would have been worn by Admiral Donitz. The citations for the awards of the Military Cross to Major Crofts and Lieutenant Croxford.
Thank the Right Worshipful Mayor for having us here tonight. And although I've seen you about 3 times this week already, I think in your own town hall, I'd just like to congratulate you on your election. And it's a very special election, the 644th mayor, if I've got that right, the youngest ever mayor of Hereford, and probably the only one who's likely to get married during a term of office. So could we have a round of applause for... I'd also like to thank Roger Phillips, Chairman of the Council, for sponsoring tonight, and Marius Coulon, who's from the Shropshire Museum, who's allowed the baton to come out. And there's also a generous sponsor, because the baton is very valuable. One of my friends early on thought they'd like to see it on their dining room table. I think it's been bid for at £2 million, am I correct? So it's a very valuable item. And so whoever was kind enough to pay for the insurance anonymously, we're enormously grateful. I'd like to thank Andy enormously. Of course, he is the best possible person to do this talk. I mean, not only is he a brilliant speaker, but as the County Colonel of the Rifles and as the honorary curator of the Herefordshire Light Infantry Museum, he really is up on it all. And it has given us all a time to learn and reflect 10 days after VE Day about this extraordinarily important event. And it is wonderful to have the artifacts you've brought, including that extraordinary letter from Speer, the pennants, and also to see that extraordinary film with the really extraordinary jaunty music going on while these things were happening. So Andy, thank you enormously. I'm proud that we've got someone of your calibre to talk to us in Herefordshire. I'm really proud that we've got the pennants here. And I think on this day, without being too serious, I think we must be very proud of the Herefordshire Regiment for what they achieved. Thank you all very much.
That concludes the story of Blackout, the last operation of World War II in Northwest Europe, the Herefordshire Regiment's part in it, and how Grand Admiral Donitz's baton ended up in Shrewsbury and his car pennants in Hereford. If you want more information on the regiment, then please take a look at the museum's website.